Hi, Dan.
Hey, Karen, how are you?
Good. And hello to everybody else out there. I am talking today to Dan Frank. And Dan is interested in systems of learning. And I'm really eager to hear from him about something called generative change. And also, he's got some tie-ins with that to neuroscience and photography and some other things like that. So let's see where we can go with this. So Dan, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background so that everybody would kind of know how you got to this place of being involved in these things.
You bet. So my original background from an academic standpoint is in computer science. And so I went to graduate school in computer science and was quite interested in things like operating systems and systems for storing and retrieving data, kind of analyzing and understanding data. And I think that in many ways, later on as I looked at neuroscience, that was helpful for me, both in terms of kind of having a model for looking at, certain kinds of problem solving and computation, but also because I think you spend enough time in computer science and you realize that there are many different kinds of computation and learning, some of which where kind of cybernetic models don't really apply. And but I think in terms of understanding things like processes, I think a computer science background was really useful. After I left computer science grad school, I worked in primarily the technology industry for a long time, and along the way also pursued an MBA. And my MBA work was largely in kind of organizational development and organizational control systems. So both of those kinds of the academic background kind of led me to be very interested in systems, and which now leads to sort of systems of thinking and kind of personal systems of how we organize our lives. And it also affects the things that I do in my professional life. So it all is kind of useful content and information.
So when you were growing up, were you always interested in mathematics, or did you just go into computer science because you thought that would be the most valid career for your future?
I think I kind of ended up there because I was good at it. I wasn't particularly a math whiz, and I'm really not particularly a math whiz. There's a lot of kinds of mathematics that get quite beyond me. My interest was really more. I was interested in music. I was interested in history, and my undergraduate studies were in history, particularly the history of thought, intellectual history and history of thought. Again, I think it all comes down to an interest in systems. History is really the story of kind of people's evolution through different ways of living together and organizing societies, organizing commerce, organizing political kinds of relationships. And that's what continues to fascinate me about history, which I continue to sort of study on the side as well.
Wow, so that makes some more connections. So the history of thought. So throw out a few names for me there.
Well, actually, one of my favorite courses was the history of the early Christian church, and so it was the early Christian thinkers, St. Augustine, for example, later thinkers like St. Anselm, Nicholas of Cusa, and Erasmus of Rotterdam. Again, medieval thinker is really a big favorite of mine because in many ways Erasmus, his thought really kind of presaged modern kinds of classical liberalism, and thought oriented around sort of individual thriving and the autonomy of the individual.
I don't know if you've heard of Paul Vanderklay
no, I haven't.
Or John Vervaeke.
Not really.
Okay, these are two guys that are kind of working on what's called the meaning crisis. This thing that's happening amongst so many young people where they've kind of lost their thread of what it means to be human, and they've sort of given up on life. And both of those guys, I think, were very interested in this book that came out recently, which I can't remember the name of, but it's about the kind of debate between Erasmus and Luther, and how that kind of played out, and how those two sets of ideas kind of diverged and set us up on one side for the Enlightenment, and then some of the other ideas that might be in opposition to that. And so Paul talked quite a bit about that, and it was pretty interesting to me because I had never studied any of those things when I was in college. I had a pretty bad experience in terms of history of thought. We sort of brushed the surface of Alexander Pope and a few of those guys, but not really much of anything in depth. So when I started hearing people talk about those things in depth, I get quite fascinated. So St. Augustine, St. Anselm, and Nicholas of Cusa. I just ran into Nicholas of Cusa the other day with some things I was reading. Wasn't he also involved somehow in mathematics?
I believe so. It has been a very long time. So
Yeah.
I've probably forgotten about much more than I learned.
Yeah, I know. That's the way it is when we get excited about one thing. We start going down that track, and then later we pack in a whole bunch of other things on top of it. I learned Spanish in high school, French or German in college, French in graduate school, and then I moved to Japan. And by the time I learned Japanese, I couldn't remember any Spanish, German, or French. But now if I try to speak Japanese, the only thing that happens is that German, Spanish, and French words pop into my head. So knowledge is a very funny thing. And I'm also interested in the fact that you love music, because that seems to fit together quite well with computer science and mathematics, that, they're all that kind of mathematical language way of thinking. So let's move on to this thing that you have recently become interested in terms of, is that a system of learning, this generative change therapy thing?
Well, it's really an approach to coaching and to personal change, and it derives from a lot of earlier sources in kind of both thinking about how people think and about bringing about change, and also sources in psychotherapy. I'm not a therapist, but I'm not a licensed therapist. The work that I do is more about kind of goal-focused coaching in that area.
Mm-hmm.
But my own teacher was a student of someone from the last century named Milton Erickson, who you may have heard from or heard about. Excuse me.
I did a little research on him after you told me about him. So
yeah, he was an unusual character. He was actually also from Wisconsin, as I am, and so maybe I was particularly charmed by that. And he was a very interesting guy. He actually suffered from polio when he was I think he was 16 or 18, I forget which, I think around 16. And he was completely paralyzed and was not expected to live. And he had all his time on his hands and did in fact live and survive, and really learned a lot from sort of experimenting on himself in terms of retraining himself to know how to move. And from being completely paralyzed and being considered by the doctors to be, kind of a hopeless case, by the time he was 18 years old, so he must have had, I think, the polio around 16. By the time he was 18 years old, he took a solo canoe trip, river camping trip, and went on to go to medical school and then become a psychiatrist, an MD and a psychiatrist. Worked in mental hospitals in Boston and Michigan. And as his health began to fail, based partly on sort of post-polio syndrome and kind of the after effects of kind of using his muscles in a way that they weren't really meant to be used, he was no longer very well. His wife suggested that they move to Phoenix, Arizona. And in Phoenix, he set up in private practice. And then sort of that was kind of the second major phase of his life, of his career. Then the third phase, after he really retired from private practice, people kind of discovered him as a teacher. And he was a good friend of Gregory Bateson. Bateson was married to Margaret Moore, the anthropologist. I think, Margaret Mead, excuse me. Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead is probably better known than Gregory Bateson, but Bateson's actually a very important character in both anthropology and psychology. And when they were going to be going to Bali to study the Balinese trance dance, a friend of theirs said, hey, if you want to know about trance, the guy who really knows about that stuff is this psychiatrist named Milton Erickson. And so they went and met him and talked with him and got some information. And Bateson and Erickson became lifelong friends. His marriage didn't last that long. I think he and Margaret Muir divorced fairly shortly after, but they were good friends through their whole life. And it's sort of interesting how sort of all these relationships connect historically when you kind of look at these lineages of thought. Because years later, Bateson was a fellow teacher at UC Santa Cruz with a couple guys named John Bandler John Grinder and I forget Bandler's first name right now, but Bandler and Grinder, who were the creators of something called Neurolinguistic Programming, or NLP. And NLP was really built initially kind of as an attempt to model how different kinds of approaches to therapy were done. And Bateson was friends with Richard Bandler and John Grinder. That's right. And Bateson said, well, if you're studying sort of use of language, essentially what they had said is that all psychological problems and approaches to solving psychological problems really derive from a paucity of language. So if you look at their first book, it said that what you need to do, and this was kind of based largely on their observations of Fritz Perls, was you had to look at the sort of short sentences that people had, and you saw that there was all this information missing from the sentences, and so you would try to then build their sort of language back up. An example of that would be, I'm afraid, right? Well, you're afraid of what, right? I mean, I'm afraid of failing, right? Well, what are you afraid of failing at? And you sort of chunk down until you could understand kind of the full sentence that the person was unconsciously sort of holding, right? And so the whole theory, or initial theory around NLP, was that kind of the more words the better, right? That all our problems derive from the fact that we use this mental shorthand and that we haven't sort of really built out our thoughts completely. And Bateson, after seeing the initial work that Bandler and Grinder did, said, well, you shouldn't just look at this. He said, I know this guy in Phoenix, Arizona, and he's a psychiatrist, and everything he does is about a great deal of ambiguity and using less words. And you really should get to know this guy. And so they, Bandler and Grinder, met Erickson, and they found that, in fact, he had developed kind of a system of psychotherapy, which now kind of bears the name Ericksonian psychotherapy. He actually lent his name to a whole approach to psychotherapy. And he used a combination of techniques. It's hard to characterize him. He was so incredibly creative that everybody who tries to characterize him ends up it's sort of like the blind man and the elephant. Everybody does sort of one leg of the elephant, or the trunk, or the tail, or the leathery skin, or whatever. But I would just say he developed this extraordinarily creative approach that had to do often with meeting the client kind of where they were in their world, right?
Well, he also took a very idiosyncratic approach, right?
Yeah.
Tailored exactly to that individual. Yeah,
to each individual, right? Yeah. Kind of meeting them where they are. There's a story about Erickson. I hope you don't mind if I tell a couple Erickson stories here.
No, it's really interesting to me. And well, let me just insert here, when you were talking about the paucity of language, it made me think about a story in Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. I think it's in 12 Rules for Life, where he's talking about this young woman whose personality was so empty that she didn't know who she was. She had no idea who she really was. And she was going through life like in this, just in a fog all the time, misunderstanding everything that happened around her, because she was basically not fleshed out in a way, not filled in. And so when you were talking about how you start with a sentence like, I'm afraid, and then I'm afraid of what? And you know, and then just keep going until you've filled in what's actually there. It's like taking an empty matrix and putting flesh on it, you know, or filling up a neural network with filling up all the nodes with information. That
Yeah.
has to take place before a person can understand who they are.
Sort of the language of NLP, you know, sort of again, Bandler and Grinder at Santa Cruz, was that that the problem that many problems result from the fact that we have incomplete maps of the world.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Right.
Exactly.
One of the key tenets of NLP is that there's a saying in NLP: the map is not the territory, and that is that that the outside world, what we perceive is not the outside world. What we perceive is kind of our map, our internal map of the outside world. And later on, you know, and this is an insight that also goes into some of the stuff that I do around photography. And so kind of what they said is that sort of those shortcomings in language also tie into a shortcoming in the internal map. And that you can't sort of find your way out of a problem unless your internal map is complete enough, right? That it's got the roads and the rivers and the pathways, you know, kind of marked on it. And that once you sort of can enrich that map, then someone can sort of find their way to where they need to go. But when your map is incomplete, when your map is really impoverished, like the woman you described, you can't get anywhere because you can only work within the map you have. And which I think is an important insight. I think you know, this sort of difference between our maps and the outside world is a very important concept. Yeah,
well, it ties in very well to what Jordan Peterson has been trying to teach for 30 years now from his book, Maps of Meaning. And I have this quote from Jordan Peterson that I'd like to just put in here and get your take on it, because I think it fits in very well with what you're talking about. He says, lack of faith in your personal ability is precisely equivalent to fear of the unknown. A failure to take notice of negative consequences and then a failure to act to address the problem results in a restriction of meaning. Now, what he's talking about there is that the world is made up of the known and the unknown, or the order that we've already created in our life and the chaos that we're facing. So there's this border between, you know, you talk about the map, the internal map that guides us through the territory. But if our internal map is incorrect, or if we don't have enough information about the territory, then we can't navigate. So when we're at the border of the unknown, we're faced with an infinite number of choices. And how do we decide which one of those choices to take, right? But if you don't have faith in your own ability, if you don't understand yourself well enough, there's no way you can even begin to make those choices in a way that's going to help you navigate. And so then if you begin on that path and you run into reality, something negative happens, the only way to succeed, the only way to continue forward in a meaningful way is to take notice of that negative consequence. Let's say one of my problems in the past was overeating. It's easy to overeat because there's no immediate negative consequence, and you can convince yourself, well, that's not going to show up tomorrow. Maybe a month from now that'll be a problem, but it's not a problem right now. So if I don't take note of that negative consequence, and if I don't adjust myself today and say, well, I ate too much at lunch, I'd better eat less at dinner. If I don't make that adjustment, then I'm going to come face to face with reality over and over again in very negative ways. So if my behavior creates a problem and I don't address the problem, then I'm going to fail over and over and over again. And if that's the way I live my life, it's deeply restricting the possibility of meaning, because I get caught in this endless loop of failure. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah, and I think these things relate very closely. One of the sort of key tenets to the whole idea of sort of generative change work is that also that our mind is not just one thing, and that we live in kind of a time that that Cartesian, sort of Descartes wrought, right? That and the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio in Iowa wrote a wonderful book many decades ago now called Descartes' Error, in which he talked about the way that we choose and the way that we make decisions. And he said Descartes' error was to think of our decision making in terms of rational thought, when in fact the primary function of rational thought is to justify decisions that we've already made, and that to a great extent, this sort of overlay of rational cognition, forebrain, right, neocortex on sort of older structures, its primary use is to kind of do the final check on our impulses. That is, it has a primarily inhibitory and evaluatory function, and also a sort of gatekeeper function on cognition and perception.
Well, okay, I have to clarify here for a second. When you talk about that we primarily use rational thought to justify decisions we have already made, and that it has, what part is it has the inhibitory and evaluatory function that acts as gatekeeper?
That would be sort of our newest neurological structures, right? Forebrain, stuff up here, and what the main value, and again, Damasio talks extensively about this from a neuroscientific standpoint. The main value of that kind of rational thought is to kind of, again, do kind of the final evaluation. I'll just give you an example. For example, I worked in the business world in kind of general management kinds of functions, typically around product management, things like that. And so I worked with a lot of senior leaders in companies. And what I found was that no decision was ever reached on a rational basis. In other words, if there's a CEO and he wants to buy a company, right? He doesn't want to buy that company because he has a spreadsheet and the spreadsheet says you should buy the company. He wants to buy the company based on what we would call his intuition or his judgment. That is, he is going through a decision-making process, but most of that is sort of at a less than conscious level. And so what happens is he kind of goes to the strategy people and he says, I want to buy the XYZ company. I just think it would be important for us as an acquisition. And they go and they do, right, due diligence. So they get out the spreadsheets. Right? They get out the spreadsheets. They go ask questions, right? They put together a questionnaire. They consult experts. They talk to the investment bankers. They go through a process, and they either say to the CEO, what you hope, right, is that they say to the CEO, yes, the numbers bear out what your intuition says is right. Let's buy the company. Or they go to the CEO and they say, we've run all the numbers and we don't see how this could ever work. Right? And then the CEO either says, okay, bad idea, we'll try something else, I feel really bad. Or the CEO says, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway. Right? Well, we're like that as human beings, right? We want things, right? So you want the extra helping of cake, right? Or you did, right? You want the extra helping of cake. And that's what you want. You've already decided that's what you want. But then there's that other part of you that goes, do you really need that extra helping of cake? And here's all the reasons why later on you're going to really regret that. Mm-hmm. The other part goes, but I want it, right? And you've got this sort of internal conflict, this internal dialogue. And that's really that experience of sort of wanting A, but then B happens, right? Either you want A and it's not good for you and you're trying to say this is not good for me, or you want something positive for you, but then something else shows up.
Well, I guess what surprises me is that you're saying that Damasio called that our rational thought. I would never have put those two together.
Damasio didn't call it irrational thought. Damasio said rational thought is an overlay on our real decision-making processes. And the way the way he reached this conclusion was by looking at people with neurological defects. And the people that he looked at were people who had had injuries that resulted in them not being able to directly experience emotion. So they actually had brain lesions or other injuries that caused them not to get emotional about things. Right? They were like Mr. Spock in Star Trek, right? Completely rational, right? So, like he's supposed to be. He isn't really, right? But he's supposed to be, right? But what he found was they made terrible decisions. You would think that sort of if we eliminate all the emotion, that we would make great decisions because we have all this rational thought. Turns out decisions are too complicated, right? That as a practical matter, there's just too many possible outcomes, too many variables, that all of this kind of less than conscious, non-rational processing that we do, which is we kind of now think of almost as neural network or deep learning kind of processing, that now we're just modeling how the human brain does it, right? All that processing is a different kind of thought. It's a non-rational reasoning, a non-rational thought. And it's highly effective at large numbers of things. There's a small number of things it's not very good at, right? And so, the reason that you see us kind of evolving or developing this overlay of kind of what we would think of as rational or logical thought is to kind of fill in the deficits of that non-rational reasoning. But if you strip away all the non-rational reasoning, all the emotion, all the affect, right, and feeling, what you find is people can't make up their minds effectively. They literally can't make good decisions.
Well, so is this one of the reasons that the people who are really working on AI, trying to get it to do more advanced things, have found that they keep running into this problem where AI can't do this kind of decision making because AI is more or less relying on strictly rational, logical processes. One of the examples that I heard recently was they were trying to get AI to be able to figure out a way to put legs on this robot to go from point A to point B in the most efficient manner. And the person who was programming the robot imagined that, of course, the AI would put legs on the robot, human legs of some sort, something like human legs, so that the robot could move from point A to point B very efficiently. But the robot thought the most efficient way to get from point A to point B is just make really, really, really long legs that are so long that it only takes that for the robot just has to fall over one time. And it gets from point A to point B immediately. So the AI isn't going through the same process of thinking that we go through. So what you're basically saying, I think, is that we have to go beyond, not that irrational thought is a good thing, but that we go beyond rational thought. We have something that is larger than rational thought.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really great way to put it. And the mechanics of that, as it's described kind of in this idea of generative change work, the mechanics of that really are that you want to be able to harness that ability to think in this non-rational way at critical times. One of the things that characterizes the human brain is its extraordinary efficiency. For everything the human brain does, I don't know if you know, like how many watts of power the human brain uses?
Less than a light bulb.
It's about 15 watts.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're doing everything we do neurologically with about 15 watts. And that's incredibly efficient. And so when you think about sort of how human cognition works, it isn't important. In a way, we've kind of come at human cognition in the past the way that robot came at locomotion. right? The robot said, well, there's this like very reasonable thing that just says we're going to make it in one step, right? But that doesn't turn out to be very practical, right? And it turns out that that the way human cognition developed is it developed for efficiency. It was purpose built, right? For a particular environment and a particular purpose. And so it developed to be efficient. And if you look at like, what do we need to do, even as like highly intelligent creatures, like what do we have to do day to day? And it turns out that what I did yesterday is mostly what I did today, and mostly what I did the day before that, and mostly that I did the day before that. In other words, almost all my behavior is habitual. And when we look at, say, cortical structures for movement, there's actually this area, these things called pyramidal neurons, where those structures are entirely for the purpose of storing motor programs. What's a motor program? A motor program is a habitual motion, right? Walking, right? So when we talk about muscle memory, right? Muscles don't have memory. But what we mean by muscle memory typically is we mean motor programs. And so the brain has structures for doing new things, right? For learning, right? We have an amazing ability to learn. But a huge amount of our brain structure is there to perform habitual activities that we're going to do over and over and over again, and it would be highly inefficient to have to learn them again. And so we have these structures that are capable of enormous creativity, right? Of harnessing enormous generativity, which is why we talk about generative change, right? That really means creative change. But on a practical basis, we can't live in a state of complete creativity all the time. It's like, today I'm going to live my life in a totally different way than I lived it yesterday, right? We know a few people like that, and they don't live very good lives, right? We think they're kind of, they're not crazy, but they're just, they don't live very effective lives. If every day they wake up and I'm going to do something completely different today, right? We're effective because we're very good at creatively finding ways to live that are sort of efficient and effective and positive, right? And then a big part of what we do is we kind of enforce on ourselves those habits and behaviors, right? And so, when you say, I'm going to have healthy habits, right? I'm going to develop some healthy habits. Well, that means every day I'm going to get up, I'm going to eat pretty healthy, and I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and decide I'm going to have a whole chocolate cake, right? And so there's a mechanism in the human brain and in human neurology that's basically says, these are the things I'm going to do now. I know they work because they've worked really well for me, right? And I'm not going to get up tomorrow and decide I'm going to walk in a different way. I'm not going to stumble tomorrow just for fun, right? I'm going to walk this way using these motor patterns. And most of the way that we live year to year, day to day, month to month, year to year, is basically this habitual behavior. Even I think someone estimated like 85% of the thoughts that I think today are going to be the thoughts I thought yesterday, even, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't make me a bad person. It actually makes me efficient. However, the question is, what happens when something in your environment changes and you have to come up with a different way of going forward? Mm-hmm. And it can be a general change in your life as a whole. And these often happen at key life events and inflections, right? When I go from being a child in my parents' home to independent at college, when I go from college into my first job, when I go from single to being married, when I go from being part of a couple to being parents with a family, and then when I go to being an empty nester, right? My children are all the way at college. I'm not a parent anymore. I look at my spouse and I go, what next, right? Mm-hmm. And so at these key inflection points in our life, as well as other points that may arise, the death of a loved one, things like that, major crises, we have what's essentially a crisis, where what we're trying to do is we're trying to do something in the way we always did it before. And everything that worked well for us before is now our problem. And in fact, I think it was Erickson. I'm not sure I'm getting the quote right, as whether it's Erickson or somebody else said that what was your what was the solution to your problem at one point has now become your problem, right? And at those moments, you need to engage your very deep and innate ability for creative thought. And
So
that,
how would you interpret that Erickson quote? What was the solution to your problem at one point is now your problem? Could you flesh that out for me a little bit?
so it's very true. Say coping mechanisms, for example. So I may be at the beginning of my career. I may be kind of insecure. I may be nervous, right? I may have a tendency toward anxiety, right? And so what I do is I organize my life around my work. And and this is hypothetical, right? I'm not talking about me, but like, I may organize my life around my work. I may be very hard charging. Everything is now going into my work. And I become very successful, and I'm always moving forward. So I never, that anxiety and sense of insecurity I felt has been kind of submerged. I found a way to kind of put that aside and just really focus on my work now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we almost all, at some point, will hit a point where life starts feeling kind of empty, right? This is not my beautiful house, right? As the song goes, right? And you look around and you go, I don't like this, right? I don't like this. I need more. And yet every habit in my life, right, is designed around my work. My relationships are bad. My children think I'm a jerk. I'm not close to my spouse. I don't like my friends. And people, this is midlife crisis, right? This is often what we would call midlife crisis. But we call it a midlife crisis, but this kind of crisis can occur at all different parts in someone's life. And they occur again and again, by the way. Just because you got it right once, it's going to happen to you again. Life's going to get you, right? Mm-hmm. And so at that point, you have to say, what was the solution to my problem before that helped me get through my 20s into my 30s is now my problem. All this work is just making my life feel completely empty, and it's keeping me away from things that would be fulfilling and meaningful for me. And now I need to find something else. Does that example help?
Yes, it certainly does. I mean, the instant you said coping mechanisms, I got a picture in my mind. But this fleshes it out even more, makes it more pertinent for the kind of thing that you're talking about. When you said coping mechanism, I thought, oh yes, when I used to use a bag of potato chips to get over being sad, that was the solution to my problem.
It is, and that's a good example, right? That's also a good example, right? It's like, like carbs are a great way to like kind of keep things like feeling good and calm, right? Yeah. And then one day you wake up and you've got type 2 diabetes, right? Yeah. And so that coping mechanism doesn't work anymore. And what are you going to do now, right? Yeah. And so again, that's a case of very often what's a solution for us at one point in our life is a problem for us at another. And then the question becomes, what do you do about it, right? I think a lot of schools of thought about change come from the same basic place, right? They sort of understand what the underlying issue is, but they come at it in different ways and in terms of solutions. Like you add a bunch of words, right? You take words away, right? Do you try to make people's maps better through speech, through words, or do you make people's maps more complete through experiences, right? What's the best way to kind of open someone up to a sort of different way of being? And the idea behind generative change work, really is this idea that we have this dual neurology, at least dual. Probably I mean, from the standpoint of a computer scientist, we're like this incredible multi-processing network, right? Yeah. But as a simplification, right? It's a real simplification of that, to say that we have this sort of creative, simultaneous, associative, enormously fast and powerful way of problem solving at one level. We have this kind of slow, kind of time-based, rational, predictive, and also kind of reality enforcing, kind of part as well of our neurology.
Well,
And
it sounds like you're
sorry.
talking about McGilchrist's book, the Master and His Emissary. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, and this goes all the way back. This goes all the way back to William James, right? And the idea of the horse and the rider.
Yeah. Well, Paul Vanderklee calls it the elephant and the rider. But
It
yeah,
actually goes back to the 19th century in William James.
yeah.
I think he was the first one to talk about this. But yeah, the master and his emissary, right? But I think those are all interesting ways of looking
Well,
at
the
the
thing that I
relationship.
found interesting about the discussion about the master and his emissary is that, I mean, I always knew that we had two hemispheres, but I always assumed that the analytic left brain was the one that was in charge. But the way McGilchrist talks about it, it's really the intuitive, exploratory right brain that's in charge, and the left brain is used more like as an it's the right brain outsources the analytic tasks to the left brain. Is sort of, I mean, that's real shorthand for what he's talking about, but it's not the left brain that's in charge. It's the right brain that's in charge, which I think is pretty fascinating, especially if I think about, because I often think about couples that way, that the husband is more left brain and the wife is more right brain. So yeah, go for it, women.
Yeah. I think there's clearly functional differences between the hemispheres. I think that one of the insights of neuroscience over the last few decades is that it's way more complicated than that. Right.
Yeah.
Again, it's a
Well,
useful
right. His book
it's a useful metaphor, right?
His
And
book,
clearly, for example, people talk about language as being located exclusively in the left brain. In a normal person, sometimes it's switched, but in a normal person, we think of language as being, primarily in sort of Broca's area in the left brain. But in fact, there's a counterpart to Broca's area in the right brain, and they connect right through the corpus callosum and other structures. And what they've discovered is that the semantics and syntax is in the left brain, and the music of language is in the right brain. So as I speak, right, a lot of what I'm doing in speaking today is, and when we talk about people who are public speakers or they're actors or whatever, those are people who cultivate the music of the language for emphasis, right? And so I'm emphasizing words. I'm raising my voice at sometimes, lowering my voice at others. And a huge amount of the meaning of what I'm conveying to you is not in the words themselves. It's not in the syntax and the semantics. It's in the music of the language. Right, and if the music of my language doesn't match my words, if I say, Karen, I really like you. What's wrong with this picture, right? What do you get, right? You don't get, I like you. You get, ugh, right?
That's always the way I feel.
That's it, right? This is language too, right?
Say, but I always feel that way when I hear somebody speaking German. Doesn't matter what nice thing they're saying. I'm like, ooh.
Well, and that's sort of our reaction when we don't understand the music of the language, right? And kind of what it means. Yeah. And so much of the meaning is in gesture, right? It's like, I'm really fond of you, right? There's this broad range of communication, and the right brain has a lot more to do with all of that, with sort of gesture, music, things like that.
What about
and our interpretation and production? Sorry?
What about symbolic thinking? Symbolism, metaphor, is that a left brain or a right brain thing?
I would say yes.
Okay.
And that's where it gets complicated, right?
Yeah.
Because when we talk about, people used to use these words sort of unconscious and conscious, right? Freudian, like unconscious, conscious. I don't tend not, sometimes, again, I'll use those as shorthand. But what I really think of is there's really these two different kind of modes of cognition and thought. And I think that both hemispheres, the reason I think the hemisphere model is so limiting is I believe, at least, without a great deal of evidence, right? It's more intuition than anything, that both hemispheres are participating in both kinds of thought. And that in fact, more of the rational thought isn't really a hemispheric issue, it's a lobe issue, right? In other words, this sort of prefrontal cortex here is involved in most of these sort of reasoning and inhibitory functions. But we also are coming to realize that this idea of areas, right, of specific centers for things is also limiting. That the number of connections in the brain is so high that that the more neuroscientists can sort of dig down into what the brain is doing in a living brain, the more interesting and complicated those things get. And so, but I would say that metaphorical thinking involves functions of really both lobes. Because metaphors are symbols, right? But that has semantic, right? There's symbols with semantic value. And so we have semantics that we apply to sentences, right? But there's also semantics of art. I'm looking at the art on the wall behind you, right? And that art on the wall behind you, I take it these are probably some of your pictures that you painted, is that right? So I'm looking at the art on the wall behind you, and I'm saying, there's a whole semantics, there's a whole meaning, right, to that painting, but it's not words. And I might not even be able to express it in words, but I can feel it, right? And I don't think that's right brain. I think that semantics, right? If semantics is largely kind of a left brain thing, semantics can be expressed in a whole lot of different ways. Even in music, right? We talked earlier about music, the idea that there's kind of rhythm and tone and all those things, but then there's the structure of a sonata. There's a cadence. There's sort of the meaning and semantics of a cadence that concludes a work or a phrase, right? Those things are semantic. So is that right brain? Is that left brain?
So
right?
I have to ask a question, because this is something that was troubling me the other day when I was doing research for our talk today. You know, I know they don't use the word conscious and unconscious very much anymore because we tend to think differently about it. But there certainly are things that are below the liminal level for me, you know, and then there are other things that are salient, that are, you know, noticeable to me. So is that a lobe or hemisphere difference, or are both hemispheres sometimes conscious and sometimes being used for the unconscious or subconscious? And like dreaming, does that use both hemispheres, or?
I presume it does, actually, and it probably uses others. Remember that there's other structures in the brain that are not part of the hemispheres, right? There's all of these sort of what are called subcortical structures, right, that are not hemispheric.
Well, Jordan Peterson is always talking about that, the most basic, I can't think of it, the one that's at the base of the...
Well, there's the brain stem, and then there's the cerebellum.
Yeah, well...
The cerebellum is actually a highly specialized fund.
Whatever the brain stem is, it's at the bottom. I can't remember what that's called.
Yeah. Well, there's this big sort of fist-shaped thing at the back called the cerebellum. And what they think now mostly is that the cerebellum has to do with completion of actions. That is, that the cerebellum doesn't kick in. Like if you reach for something, like, you know, I reach for this cup, right? Up until here, it's all motor program, right? This is all pyramidal structures in the cortex. I get to about here, the cerebellum turns on. And it's the completion of the action. It's the fine completion of the action. And where you have cerebellar damage, where you have injuries and lesions to the cerebellum, what you end up with is something called intentional tremor. Intentional tremor is smooth motion to here and then this, because the cerebellum is injured, right? So there's, in a single motion, it transitions through multiple brain structures, which again is why you can't just go, that's right there. Like this place right here is like where your hand motion is. Now, that's not quite right, right? And in fact, even right here, there's layers, right, that do different things, that are learned versus habitual. But then once you transition to very fine motion and completion, it transitions to the cerebellum. So again, the old models were very oversimplified.
This is all very interesting to me because just the other day I did a conversation with a young man named Michael, and we were talking about a female philosopher epistemologist by the name of Esther Lightcap Meek, who has an epistemological theory called covenantal epistemology. It's a way of thinking about knowing. How do we know and what do we know? And when she talks about knowing, one of the examples that she used is when you teach a child to ride a bicycle, you can't explain to the child how to balance and here's what you must do and write them a little booklet and have them learn all the rules and then they're just magically going to be able to ride the bicycle. Something has to happen inside of them. That knowledge is embodied. It's like it's already there. And in the act of beginning to try to ride the bicycle and, learning and failing over and over again, that embodied knowledge kind of takes form. So it's almost like there's this big, we have this surface knowledge, which we can talk about and write about, the semantic and the skill level and all of that. Then underneath that, there's this iceberg under the water, so to speak, which is already a very significant part of us, embodied in our bodies, our muscles, our brains, all the different parts of the hemispheres. And that part of knowing is, she says that's very relational. That it's a matter of getting to know, getting to having an interactive experience with the thing that you know. And here, another example would be knowing your rose bush is the same thing as knowing a friend or a husband, because when you begin to work on the rose bush, you learn what happens to the rose bush when you're working on it, and it gives you feedback. And that feedback back and forth as you're working on that, and as you're learning about the rose bush, as you're learning about roses, that feedback process fleshes out fills in this iceberg underneath the water in a way that's not just something that your brain is doing. So it's very, it's not necessarily not what your brain is doing, but it goes beyond the rational thought. That's what she was really talking about.
There's an experience. There's a sort of thou with the rose bush, right? Which is the same thing that two human beings.
Or a dance.
Right.
There's a dance that goes on.
Yeah. So I've kind of two things that I want to respond, because you kind of talk about two different things. With regard to the bicycle thing, another example of that is language and understanding language.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about sort of the iceberg, the sort of 7/10 or whatever below the surface, the fact that you can understand what I am saying is the result of entirely less than conscious processes. In other words, there's a level of processing that is going on to convert the raw waveforms coming through your oral nerves of your inner ear into your brain, getting converted to phonemes getting assembled into words getting tested for semantics. There's a whole set of predictive functions. Turns out prediction's incredibly important in language understanding. So your brain is always predicting what's going to happen next. Almost all that prediction takes place at an unconscious level. What has to go into understanding what I'm saying to you, which includes all those predictions about what's going to happen next and what I'm going to say next and what the next word is going to be, and then figuring out the semantics and understanding my meaning, and right, all of that stuff took you years to learn. Right, took years for your brain to work up to that ability. Right, several years as a child, and then to refine it as you got older. And now it happens automatically. And it's so unconscious that you completely take for granted that you don't often think, unless you're a neurologist, you don't often think, how the heck did I just understand what Dan said, right? But that visual perception is very similar. And then there's this thing nobody understands yet, which is, how do I unify everything coming in through my senses, as well as the reactions of my body, into a single moment of experience, right? That happens out of our eyesight. We can't see that happening either. We simply experience this moment as a single moment. You see my lips move, you hear the sound, and you identify the movement of my lips as associated with the sounds that I'm making. And what's more, you can use the movement of my lips to help you understand what I'm saying. So if I'm talking to you in a noisy room, we're at a party, it's crowded, it's very, very noisy. it's likely you will understand more of what I'm saying if you're watching my lips, right? You use that to predict and to make guesses about what I'm saying. All that happens unconsciously, right? And we're kind of vain, right? Our education, the way we're educated, teaches us to think of ourselves as being primarily conscious. That almost everything happens sort of within sort of our field of view, when in fact almost nothing happens within our field of view. In fact, our field of view doesn't happen within our field of view because our eyes can only see a tiny little bit, and yet I think I'm seeing all this, but I'm not.
Well, the other thing that happens that I think is really fascinating is if two people are having a conversation like this, and if you would throw in some reference to some song that you liked, or a quote from a book, or say, oh, that's William James from 100 years ago. That's like a little data bomb almost. It's like that when that word comes at me, it clicks a link inside my processor that opens up a web page of all kinds of information that's available to me from inside my storage capacity. And it opens up that little data bomb, and I have this immediate understanding of, oh yeah, that's William James from 100 years ago. If those aren't just words with a semantic meaning, that opens up a whole set of knowledge of something that I've read in the past.
Yes.
Where, and we all have those. We have this entire database within us of our own idiosyncratic way of understanding every word that we hear. And all of our experiences are stored in these little capsules that can get tapped on at any moment, and the entire memory comes back. Fragrance, especially like that. You can smell a fragrance and an entire experience will come back to you full blown. And that is definitely beyond rational thought.
Oh yeah,
and
all persuasion fundamentally is that.
Yeah, the fact that we can communicate with each other is remarkable because we both have separate databases, and all the things that we have stored in those databases are idiosyncratic to us and our own experiences. So the fact that we can make sense of each other is quite remarkable.
Well, luckily, we evolved to be social animals. And I was just listening. There's a lovely podcast called the Brain Science Podcast, put out by a doctor named Ginger Campbell. And very recent episode, 1 or 2 podcasts ago, someone was talking about this ability. In fact, they were talking about their particular model of how consciousness evolves. And they said that consciousness sort of starts with a consciousness of your own, existence, right? So I'm aware of me, right? I'm aware that I'm feeling X, right? So it's that one level removed. I feel X, I'm aware that I'm feeling X. My awareness that I'm feeling X is a kind of consciousness, right? But he said the next step is not being aware that you're conscious. The next step, because like if I'm aware that I'm hungry, right, that doesn't mean I'm aware that I'm thinking I'm hungry. I'm just aware that I'm hungry, right? But he said the next step in consciousness is predicting how you're going to behave. In other words, I'm looking at you, I'm understanding that you are having states, that you are having feelings, and I want to predict what you're going to do. Why is it so important for me to predict what you're going to do? Well, you may kill me, right? You may grab a stone and throw it at me. And if you're an animal, you may attack me, right? Or you're a human being, right? So you're going to do something that's important to me, right? And so from an evolutionary standpoint, both for my own survival, but also increasingly for my ability to cooperate with other people in a social environment, right? And we evolved to live in groups, right? I'm now making predictions. I'm developing a model of you, right? And for my survival, having a model of you as conscious as aware and a predictive model that says what you might do next has really high survival value for me, right? From that, now that I have a model of you, now that I know that you are thinking and that you may do something next, the theory that this neuroscientist has is he said, now the third step is that now I develop a theory about me, right? And I say, I am aware of myself as someone who is hungry, and I predict that what that will make me do is X. Or when I feel this way, I always do X, right? And that consciousness sort of layers up out of those awarenesses, which to me is sort of that idea of the incredible importance of our consciousness of what other people are going to do and our predictions of what other people are going to do is actually a really fascinating kind of insight. And we have very important like brain structures and neurology to do those things. And when we have deficits, when we talk about deficits, it's likely spectrum disorder, right? One of the characteristics of spectrum disorder is sort of hard for me to know what you're going to do. It's hard for me to understand what your feelings are. I'm just missing, or I didn't develop, right, certain ways of evaluating that.
So where does generative change go with all this when you're actually using it to coach somebody?
So generative change is really based on this idea that, again, we go back to this model where most of the time we're really just sort of running a program. We're running existing patterns and habits. And that is highly efficient for us, and that's working for us, right? And then we hit some point in our life or some situation or some insight that kind of breaks that, where we're kind of as it were, the drugs don't work anymore, right? And we're unhappy or we're dysfunctional. And at that point, you need a solution, right, that enables you to find a new pattern, right? The idea isn't, again, to live every day differently, but it's to find a pattern that's right now, right? The way that I will live now that most kind of expresses kind of who I am, what I need, follows my bliss, as Joseph Campbell said, right? And the question is, like, how do you do that, right? And this is where you now get into like different techniques, right? Do you do cognitive behavioral therapy? Do you do talk therapy, Freudian analysis, transactional analysis, right? There's a million kinds of interactions, right? Do I shake a rattle and beat a drum? And which can often work. And so the particular approach to generative change is to go back to this idea of our neurology that says that we have this like highly creative associative part of ability to, way of thought. And we have a part of us that's kind of the enforcer, that's kind of the gatekeeper, that says, this part of me can imagine a million things, but this part of me is going to choose the one, right? This part can model the world in a million different ways. This part is going to say there's one map and one model. And as long as this map and this model is working for you, doesn't make sense. Don't go on an acid trip, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? It's not efficient. And if you need a creative solution, you got to say to this part of you, kind of shut up, right? Get out of the way and go inside and go to this part of you. That's this wonderful creative part that can explore a million simultaneous possibilities, right? There's a metaphor, it's only a metaphor or analogy, to kind of the quantum superposition of all possible states, right? And what happens is you've got the quantum superposition of all possible states, and then, that collapses to the single reality. Mm-hmm. And what we're really doing is we've been living in that single reality until it doesn't work anymore. And now the solution is you go back, you open up, you open up the flower, right? You open up the multiverse, right? And you say, and you look for that creative solution. You open up that space, right? And so generative change work is really a process, not of telling someone what to do, right? A lot of coaching, we think of coaching and we sort of think of kind of like, well, what I think you should do in the next meeting, is like, you should first talk about this point and then talk about that point and then talk about that point. Pretty prescriptive and kind of based on frameworks and models. Generative change work is based on the idea of following a pattern of getting someone to hold their goal in mind, to gather the resources that they need to kind of pursue that goal and to sort of handle emotionally the process of exploring a better way of reaching that goal, right? And then just settling down, going inside into, there's a lot of words for it. One word for it is flow state, right? Another word for it is trance, right? But that state of being very open, inwardly focused, open to all those possibilities, non-critical, right? And that non-critical part, like, got this voice in your head, you can't think that, you can't do that, you've got to do this, you've always done this, your mother wouldn't like this, someone won't think well of you, right? You've always got that voice in your ear from this part of you, right? And that part, you just say, okay, just let go. Just be quiet for a little while and listen to this part. And that's really the process. And in that, the work really consists of holding that state, of holding that place safely for someone, and also keeping them kind of, as they sort of wander back off the reservation, it's sort of in a humorous and gentle way, leading them back when they're ready, right? And they may touch multiple times, right, until they're ready to truly go all the way into this. But from this, there really arise, metaphors. We talked about metaphors before, right? Metaphors, pictures, images, faces, songs, right? This way of thinking is metaphorical. It's not primarily verbal, right? It's metaphorical. And very often, like, this part of us talks to us in images, right? So that's why in dreams, right, we gain insights in dreams, right? There's a great story about the guy who discovered the structure of the benzene molecule, right, which is a ring, right? And he was a German scientist, I forget his name, and he tried for years and years and years to understand the structure of the benzene molecule, and he just couldn't do it. And then one day, he was like right at his desk, he got tired, he fell asleep. And while he was asleep, he dreamed of a snake, of the Ouroboros, right? The snake eating its own tail. And he woke up and he realized that the benzene molecule is a ring, right? It's connected, right? The ends connect together. It's like a snake eating its own tail. But that's the way that creative part of him communicated with him, in that case in a dream, right? Because it couldn't say to him, listen, first there's a carbon atom and a nitrogen atom, right? Like this and this and this, right? That part couldn't solve the problem, right? But this part said, it's a snake eating its own tail. And that's the answer. And once he saw that, he could then apply kind of those rational structures to that insight, right? And it's one of the most important discoveries in chemistry. And so it's not supernatural, right? Like when something comes to us in a dream, it isn't because our ancestors are talking to us, although maybe they are, I don't know. But you don't have to go to supernatural things to understand that we have creative resources that are rooted in a different way of thinking that's inherent to our neural structure. In other words, our brains evolved structures that are capable on a deep level of this kind of amazing creative thought. And this is really the source of our creativity. But creativity really has to take place in a relaxed state, right? Erickson used to say that people become neurotic when they become too rigid, when they hold too tightly to things, right? Including the old ways of doing things that don't work anymore. And that all creativity is really rooted in being relaxed. There's a wonderful book that has been a big influence on me all my life. I read it when I was in high school, I think, maybe college, called Zen in the Art of Archery. I don't know if you've ever, it's written by a German named Eugen Herrigel, I think. And Zen in the Art of Archery is about his experience over many decades of studying with a Zen archery master. I don't know if you know, there actually is a thing called Zen archery. And Zen archery teaches, it doesn't teach you how to hit the target. So, most archery, Western archery, get that thing in the bullseye, right? Zen archery teaches how to draw the bow. And everything is about this perfection in the drawing of the bow. And when you can find that relaxed state of kind of total relaxed, perfect movement, then hitting the target happens as a side effect. but it's not the point. And Erickson was once asked to coach the U.S. Olympic rifle target shooting team, and he was very famous both as a psychiatrist but also as a hypnotherapist and a hypnotist. And they said, well, why don't you hypnotize these guys and make them hit the target better? And hypnotherapy is used for things like golf, like improving your golf game, things like that. It actually used quite a bit in athletics. And so what Erickson did is Erickson taught them. He said, instead of getting like this and trying to aim at the target and then you hit, pull the trigger, right? He said, just relax, look through the sights and do this. Just sway back and forth. And just move the rifle back and forth. And when you think you might hit the target, just pull the trigger.
And it worked?
Yes, it improved their performance. Because there's a part of us, right? Target shooting, right? We're doing integral calculus in our head. When I throw a ball to you, or when you try to catch a ball that I've thrown to you, you're doing integral calculus in your head, right? How do you, again, survival skill. We needed to be able to throw rocks and hit animals and kill them and eat them, right? And so, but we're not doing it the way someone does on a blackboard, right? They're not using these techniques, right? We're just doing it. We're solving these complex ballistic equations that no one could solve for years without computers. And when we're shooting an arrow or when we're shooting a rifle, we are the more we think about it, the less a chance we have of hitting it. Try tying your shoes and think about what you're doing while you're tying your shoes and what happens, right? So much of what we do, so much of what we know, our mind just gets in the way of. And our mind gets in the way of our creativity often. Our minds, this is important, right? This is super important. That's why we evolved it. But it's not everything, and it's often an impediment to problem solving and creativity, both in our lives and in the things we do day to day.
I think you would find Esther Lightcap Meek quite interesting. Yeah. Because exactly the kind of thing you're talking about right now is exactly the kind of thing that that I learned about her in having this conversation with Michael. And actually, she's going to come on my channel soon, so I'll get to have a conversation with her, and maybe you'll get a chance to see that. So, this has been just wonderful. We've been going on for an hour and 15 minutes now, which is probably longer than anybody's going to be able to stick with us.
Yeah, so. Really.
This has been so much fun, Dan. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely, it'd be my pleasure. As you can see, it's it's an area that this is sort of my bliss, right? That I follow.
Yeah, yeah. I can see that you're passionate about it, and it's very, very, very interesting area. So, thank you so much. And for anybody who's out there listening, if you like this kind of content, please click my subscribe button and click like if you can, so that we can get this thing moving through the algorithm.
Absolutely. And then thanks for the opportunity. It's been just a wonderful discussion. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this today.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. See you soon.
Thanks a lot, Karen.
Bye.
Bye.